My name is Sherry Chan, and I am the Chief Actuary for the City of New York. An actuary is someone who uses their math and analytical skills to value the cost of various liabilities. They project the cost, and then they try to state it in today's dollars. First, identify risk, and then they try to quantify it. And then once it's quantified, they monitor the risk and manage the risk. And lastly, they try to mitigate the risk.
I'm Robert C. North Jr., and I was the chief actuary for the New York City retirement systems between 1990 and 2014. An actuary is a business professional trained in the measurement of risks and rewards. Most actuaries participate in insurance actions, for example, setting premiums on your car insurance, your life insurance. There is a large group of actuaries who also practice in the area of pension plans, defined benefit pension plans, which is what the New York City retirement systems are. And in that capacity, actuaries determine employer contributions to the funds, provide reporting information, and generally advise their clients on how to make the system successful, the risks involved, the rewards involved, and how best to make changes when changes are appropriate.
I'm Jonathan Schwartz, and from July of 74 through July of 86, I was the chief actuary. I would describe it as somebody with mathematical training who evaluates the risk that's inherent in certain financial transactions. The main job was seeing to it that the annual contributions that the city made to each of its 5 retirement systems was adequate so that when all these young people became eligible to retire, there'd be money on hand to pay their benefits.
So actuaries, we don't tend to be what's called B2C. B2C is business to client, so we don't work directly with the end user. Usually actuaries work, it's B2B, so it's business to business. So we provide consulting services to other businesses and provide them with cost projections and numbers of various cost. So that's why most people who walk down the street, they don't hire actuaries just for their own personal good. They don't have personal actuaries. So we deal generally with other businesses. And so in New York, we provide the services for different agencies, including the 5 retirement systems. So one is the public employees, another is the police, another is the fire, and we also provide the actuarial services for the teachers. And the Board of Education is the 5th. The Board of Education are people who work in a school but don't teach, so you can think of janitors, cafeteria workers, bus drivers, and cross-guard workers.
The New York City Chief Actuary has certain statutory responsibilities. Statutorily, the Chief Actuary is the technical advisor to the boards of trustees of the retirement systems.
My name is Mel Aronson. I am a former trustee and chairman of the board of the New York City Teachers Retirement System. A trustee of the retirement system is a person who is got the responsibility of making sure that the retirement system fulfills all of its obligations to the members of the system and makes decisions which will help to make sure that each of the members of the system gets what they have earned for their career for the rest of their lives.
I report to the 5 retirement boards. So there's 58 board members for the 5 retirement systems in New York, so I have 58 bosses. And each board is comprised of city elected officials and the union representatives. The city is the one that pays into the pension plan. So once I calculate the pension contributions, the city is the one that makes the payments. Obviously, their objective is to try to manage the cost and keep it within range. On the other side, the unions represent the members who benefit from these retirement systems. So obviously they want to make sure that they have an adequate benefit in retirement and that their retirement money is there for them. My role as the actuary, because I calculate the numbers that the city puts in and the members benefit from, I have to make sure that they're not too far from what they should actually be. And because of the influences that a legislator many years before me was smart enough to foresee that there might be an issue, made this agency an independent agency so that I don't report just to the city side and I don't report just to the union side, so that my numbers stay true to what they financially should be.
One of the best things that I accomplished, which was part of what I requested when I accepted the job, was that the Office of the Actuary be a separate agency. The reality is that the actuary has to balance the demands of getting proper funding with the ability of the employers to pay. Many would argue the actuary has no responsibility with respect to whether the employer can pay or not. You should just do the calculations, say what you think it should be, and if they don't like it, they've just got to pay up, quote unquote. Well, the other alternative, of course, is they find another actuary. And so, as I say, oftentimes the actuary presses hard for more funding and more security for the benefits.
This position is not just about the technical actuarial work, because it's also about the 58 bosses that I report to, and learning to work with other agencies and learning to work with elected officials, because they have different agendas, and maybe the unions have different agendas from the city side, and how do you balance that? So a lot of it is about relationship management.
The actuary also tries to be realistic in doing the most that's possible. I think the best example of this would be right after 9/11. Because of the tremendous drop in the stock market, if I could have reasonably done it, I would have liked to increase the employer contributions from maybe the $700 million in fiscal year 2000 to almost $10 billion a year in 1 year. Now, the whole city budget back then was $40 billion. No, I don't think that would have been a good idea in the long run for the pension funds or for the city. A strong employer is important to the success of a strong pension fund. If you bankrupt them on day one, there's a very good chance that other bad things will happen. So instead, I found a way to persuade people to get on the right track, increase things like $600–800 million a year, year after year, and little by little keep moving back in the right direction. Right after 9/11, people had lots of other uses for the money than putting it all in a pension fund, and it would have been irresponsible to try and get all of it at once for the pension fund because of the investment losses.
So, with all the stakeholders involved and all the bosses that I report to, obviously finding a win-win situation is the goal and the hardest part of the job. My title is, the chief actuary, but sometimes, it's not the actuarial work that's part of my job that takes up the most of my time. Sometimes I feel like I'm a politician because I need to sell a certain idea. And, the actual work I do, I feel like sometimes that's the easiest, the number part, the technical part, I can, 1 + 1 is equal to 2, and I know that. And as long as I put that 1 + 1 is equal to 2, that part of my job is done. I have a loyalty to the profession, and I have to make sure that I don't cave to these desires and these recommendations from outside parties who actually are not specialized to make these calculations.
There is only one position like it anywhere in the country. The independence, the statutory authority, the ability to influence decision making, and yet the heavy responsibility, which gladly taken to try and secure benefits for people. It really is an honor.
The chief actuary is very important in the city of New York, and as is any actuary in any other retirement system, because they are the ones that are looking into, the assumptions, they're looking into the demographics to make sure that, you do have the money set aside for them. So, you think about the firefighters and the police and the teachers, they spend a great deal of their career, doing their job, and they're not focused on perhaps how much to save in retirement or how much that they need in retirement. Being the actuary, that is my job and my responsibility, and so that they don't have to worry about that.
One of the most important roles of the actuary of the New York City retirement systems is to, regardless of what anybody else says, regardless of what anybody else wants, keep pushing to make sure that the promises will be kept, that the retirement systems will be secure. The problem is it sounds maybe overly arrogant, and it isn't intended to be. It is just what part of the job is to be sure as the actuary that the security of the pensions will be there. One of the parts of the job that we don't talk that much about is that the actuary certifies everybody's benefit when they retire. Well, what does that mean? It means the actuary double checks what the retirement systems do to make sure that the benefit is calculated correctly to the penny. We deal with the individuals to make sure their individual benefits are correct, but we also deal with the trustees and the employers to make sure there's going to be enough money that that teacher or firefighter gets the benefit that we certified they will get, that the promise will be kept.
My name is Michael Palladino, and I'm the president of the Detectives Endowment Association. It's the police union that represents the rank of detective in the NYPD. There's a certain mentality that exists here in New York City with the politicians, with the actuary of the city of New York, and that is the obligation that the city has to the pension funds. I think it's a primary obligation that they take very seriously. And the most important thing for our members is that the pension funds are well funded. The reason being is because they have dedicated their life to civil service, to serving the people. And what they have done over the years through collective bargaining is they've taken less money at the bargaining table for security when they retire. All we're looking to do is maintain the modest lifestyle that we have while we're working, and we'd like to maintain it in retirement. The argument against pensions is a false argument. The whole reason why the pension funds are funded the way they are here in New York State is because they take it seriously. And the problem that exists in other states and why those states are not funded well enough, and it's a burden on the taxpayers, is because the politicians have decided to divert pension funds to fill the budgetary gaps wherever they need them, and then they fall behind and they never catch up. And that's why there's a burden on a lot of the taxpayers in a lot of other jurisdictions.
My name is Al Hagan. I retired as a captain in the fire department of the city of New York after 41 years. Most of my time in Harlem or the South Bronx. My last 6 years in the fire department, I was involved in the union, and the last 5 years, I was the president of the Fire Officers Union. The actuary has an important role in pensions, public sector defined benefit pensions, the kind of pension that everybody should have, a defined benefit pension. And the role of the actuary for us is primarily she's the guardian of the funding. So elected officials run for office to do good. Everybody understands that. It doesn't make them bad people. Contrary, it makes them good people. But the everyday mundane functions of government are not, let's say, glamorous. There's no press conference to say we funded the city today or the schools were open. So there's always a competition for resources, and elected officials, they look at the pension funds, which are full of money, billions of dollars, And they say, why can't we use some of that money to fund my pet project? What's the difference? I mean, they're not going to spend all that money. And so there's a tendency for them to want to kick the can down the road, you know, the euphemism. The actuary lets them talk and then says, nah, that's not a good idea. We need X amount of money to go in to the pension this year. Now, a big part of the money comes from the people actually working. They contribute to their own pensions. And then the city contributes its share. And the actuary's role is to fix the city's share. Firemen, police officers, school teachers, sanitation men, you'd be hard pressed to recruit people and hold them in a job with no pension. I myself, back in 1973, took the fire department job primarily for two reasons. The first reason being the pension. The second reason being job security.
People who are in private industry have almost no pensions, except for those people who work in heavily unionized industries. There are no pensions, even in very large, well-off companies. They don't provide pensions for their employees. And that is scary because it could happen to us.
Forget the city for a moment. Look at the private sector. When I started out, private companies had pension plans, had defined benefit pension plans. Nowadays, there are almost no private companies with defined benefit pension plans. There are people out there, I think, who sincerely believe, I don't think that these are people just bashing the city. They're saying, look, defined benefit plans are unaffordable, they're obsolete. You know, how do you justify the city continuing to do this? All of us who occupied this chair, from Jesse, through me, through Bob North, and through Sherry, part of the job is to persuade the decision makers that no, the defined benefits are neither obsolete nor unaffordable. It's been my experience that New York City, together with the California Public Employees Retirement System, New York City tends to be one of the leaders in wherever public systems are going. Once the city goes in a certain direction, I think most of the other systems in the country tend to go along sooner rather than later. The city tends to be a leader as opposed to unique.
So your public plans right now, I think, are highlighted in a very negative fashion. There are pension plans out there that may not have put in the pension contributions that the actuaries told them. We don't have the same concerns that other people do in the rest of the country because we have, you know, what's considered model legislation in New York State, where whatever the actuary determines, that's what the city pays in. So they cannot, by state statute, escape the annual contributions that need to go in.
Every time, and I don't care whether the actuary was Jesse or me or Bob North or Sherry Chan, we go to the city and we say, your bill for this year is X. You must pay this to keep the pension systems viable. They may mumble and grumble. They may even kick and scream a little bit, but they do put in the amount that we say. You know, that's no small thing.
Well, the term actuary is derived from the Latin term actuarius, which basically was a bookkeeper in Rome from the, say, 2nd century AD. So the concepts have been around for a long time, but modern actuarial science began in about the 16th or 17th century. The first actuary in the United States, the first recognized actuary, was in the 19th century. Pension plans first became somewhat prominent in the latter half of the 19th century. There were no defined benefit pensions pretty much prior to the New York City Police Fund in 1870.
The Office of the Actuary just celebrated its centennial a couple years ago in 2016. I think it's interesting to note that there's only been 4 prior chief actuaries before me in the city of New York, despite us being over 100 years old. The first actuary was George B. Buck, and he worked about 40 years. The actuary right before me, my predecessor, worked 25 years, and so there's some long tenure actuaries in between there. And George Buck had, laid the foundation for not just the office here and for New York City, but for the profession as well. He was first commissioned by the City of New York. He was from DC, and he was commissioned by the City of New York to do a study on the pension plans at that time, before he was hired as a full-time actuary. And the state of the pension plans at that time were in pretty bad shape. You know, they didn't make projections of how much pension benefits need to be paid out in the future. It was a pay-as-you-go system, so whatever cash flow and whatever pension benefits needed to be paid out that year is how much the city had to pay. So George Buck came along and did a study and said, and did conferences, and he spoke, you know, nationally and internationally as well, about how actuaries should have projections. They should have these probabilities of when people might retire and how long they might live, so that you can do a projection of how much benefits and how much cash flow is needed at what time. And not only that, but he said that, money should be put in a trust so that it can't be used for any other reason. Like if you set aside money for, paying widows and beneficiaries, that, you shouldn't use it for other purposes. So New York obviously adopted that, and this took on in the rest of the country. And the rest of the country started doing these projections and doing these present values and making sure that money was put in a trust so that, it was only used for pension purposes. So he really was the founding father of all this. In the 1970s, New York City had a financial crisis. They had a deadline of when to make certain payments for the bonds, which would put them in bankruptcy. And so the mayor, on the eve of that deadline, was getting ready to prioritize the necessities of the public servant, which services were necessary and which could be shut down. They had to turn to a source that had a funding source, and they tried to get all the affluent people in the city to try to pitch in money to save New York City.
The city was at a point where it couldn't make its payments on the bonds that people had bought and were entitled to interest, and some people were entitled to get their money back because the bonds matured, and the city was unable to pay that.
Nobody wanted to buy New York City bonds. The question became, what do you do? So a new authority was created called the Municipal Assistance Corporation, MAC, and the hope was that individuals would buy MAC bonds. That wasn't happening either. Nobody wanted to touch anything that had New York City on it.
There were drums of trouble beating on the other side of the hill, and everyone could hear them getting closer. In fact, the fire department sent out actual pink slips, layoff slips. And I forget the exact number of people, and I forget the exact month, but it was in the springtime of 1975. The fiscal year was coming to an end. The Wall Street was reluctant to buy bonds, and they sent out, let's say, about 200 or 250 layoff notices. And the guys who received those notices brought them into the firehouse. They put them on the kitchen table. Oh my God, what's going to happen?
The Daily News, which is, at one time the most popular paper in the city, they had a headline, "Ford to City drop dead," because the federal government wouldn't lend the city of New York any money.
So the only alternative was the pension systems had to invest a good chunk of their assets in MAC bonds.
So they came to the teachers' retirement system and to the UFT, and they said, please buy some city bonds from us, give us the money so we could take the money and pay back those people that we owe the money and not go bankrupt.
Investing in MAC bonds was a terrible alternative, but it was the least terrible of all the alternatives out there.
A month or so later, another round of layoff notices went out to firemen. It's going to be worse than we thought. We're going to have to lay off some more people. I don't know if that was cold and calculatingly done, or if it was just done as a matter of conducting business reasonably, efficiently. But shortly after those layoff notices, of course, you can imagine the union meetings dwelled on that. And then the city came to the unions and said, we need givebacks, or we're going to have to lay off everybody. And if you want to save the job or the jobs of your fellow firefighters, you're going to have to give back. And we gave back things: personal leave day, a blood day, other things, vacation time.
The two employee groups that were most reluctant to go along with District Council 37, the union that represents all the white-collar and blue-collar civil servants, and then the United Federation of Teachers. DC 37 absolutely refused to make the investment unless the Internal Revenue Service arranged to have legislation passed that would specifically authorize the city to make these investments. So I was part of a delegation that went down to Washington for an all-day and part of the night meeting to sell this to the IRS. And ultimately we did. The legislation got drafted and DC 37 made the investments. So that was, I think, something where I did make a contribution.
Well, that took a lot of courage to do. And here we have the city bankrupt, and we're giving them money from our pension fund, which we need to provide benefits for our retirees. But with promises that we got and looking at the fact what would have happened if the city went bankrupt.
That weekend had a tremendous increase in serious fires because people weren't there to respond.
The union and the trustees of that time decided that they would take the risk of buying these city bonds and saving the city from bankruptcy. It was probably one of the wisest decisions they ever made based on the large issue of saving the city.
Then came July 1st, 1975. In the FDNY, it took 7 years to keep a job. They didn't lay off the 500, they laid off well over 1,000. They closed 20 some odd firehouses the first day. At the end of that weekend, they actually hired, I forget the numbers, but they hired maybe 1,000 people back, and they opened up the firehouses.
Helping get the MAC bonds off the ground, we set up a proving ground where the city could demonstrate its ability to make required payments on schedule. And once the city had demonstrated that, then that made New York City bonds viable, and that essentially mitigated the fiscal crisis. The city had enough funds to be able to put together an operating budget.
Now, things have been pretty good since then. Things are pretty good right now. But there's a lot to be said for secure the pensions, keep the promise, get the money in the pension fund, and if that means occasional bad press, well, you fight the bad press and tell them what the truth is.
The pension funds were millions and billions of dollars, and so they bailed them out. And if the lights would have been turned off that day and the streets would have been closed that day in New York City because the teachers' retirement system didn't help them, then we wouldn't have New York City today.
I think that the people of the city of New York would be much better off if the actuary was watching all their money.